Well, I think that's my view as well. Of course, I've been asking every Swede I know what the rationale is for joining NATO. How does it help Sweden? Does Sweden profit from this relationship? Is there some strategic benefit to aligning with a group of countries in the West right now who seem to be devoted to the destruction of Russia? Uh, I don't understand how Sweden benefits from it. I hope people in Sweden are asking the same questions.
Well, the general opinion has sort of turned. Let's say a year ago, there was a lot of skepticism around Sweden joining NATO. Latest polls say that it's about 50-50 against or, for. So it's hard to say, but we have an authority in Sweden called MSB. Translated would be like the Authority for Civil Protection and Preparedness. And they're launching a massive propaganda campaign to teach Swedish people about NATO. And in their own words, they say like this: they want to eliminate NATO criticism. And that's from an authority that's very close with the military organizations in Sweden and the military command. So it's absolutely mind-boggling, the propaganda here. So it's understandable that a lot of people say, well, hey, maybe NATO, everybody says NATO is a great thing, so maybe it's true. That's sort of the situation here in the opinions. But I had another question. Excuse me. How big of a risk do you assess there would be for a direct confrontation between US/NATO and Russia? Is there a risk, or is it imminent?
No, I don't think it's imminent, but there is a very definite risk. And this is something that I think people are underestimating. The United States, excuse me, and its allies, but primarily the United States, has engaged in a series of interventions over the last 30 years in various parts of the world, always against extraordinarily weak opponents without any air defenses, opponents without any long-range strike weapons per se, opponents without navies, opponents without air forces. And we've gotten accustomed to overpowering anyone that stood in our way with massive, accurate, devastating firepower. It's that simple. There wasn't any requirement for, I would say, innovative thinking or tactics. If the opponent didn't agree to align itself with what you wanted to do, you simply called on the firepower, usually air power, but also naval and ground forces, and they readily subscribed to it. So I think that's problem number one. We're not dealing with a weak opponent. Now, there was an assumption at the beginning of this conflict that Russia was weak. I think a lot of people in Washington continued to see Russia through the lens of the mid-1990s, when admittedly Russia was in ruins. There's no question about it. But there was a tendency then to ignore the warnings of people like George Kennan and others who said, well, Russia is a great power. It's in a bad way now, but that's not going to remain a permanent condition. Therefore, you should think again about pushing NATO further east, because whatever you tell the Russians, it will be perceived as a threat. So here we are, and Russia has recovered. Now, it's interesting to me that people continually insist that Putin was always interested in invading Eastern Europe. Well, if that was the case, his army at the beginning of this conflict was actually quite small. And if he was truly interested in invading Eastern Europe, you would have thought he'd have maintained an infinitely larger and more ready force. As it turns out, he decided that he did not have the force necessary in order to protect Russia's interests in Ukraine. And so about 4 or 5 months into the so-called special military operation, he made the decision to mobilize, not nationally, but certainly partially, bringing in hundreds of thousands of reservists as well as volunteers. Well, that's occurred now, and we're looking at a Russian force on the ground in and around Ukraine of about 750,000. And now the plans are to make that force 1.2 million. Because he's decided that no one is willing to negotiate with him. No one will treat Russia's security interest as legitimate, regardless of the arguments. There's no interest in that. Therefore, he has no choice. He's got to expand the military. Well, then the argument is, well, now he wants to invade Eastern Europe, which is a bit ridiculous because he said on many occasions that he knows that the Western Ukrainians absolutely do not want to live inside Russia. He understands that. In fact, he's even made the remark, well, perhaps they'd be happier with the Poles, then walked away laughing because, of course, the relationship between Poles and Ukrainians over the last several hundred years has been a very difficult one. But at this point, I think if the Poles and Lithuanians decided to rush into Western Ukraine and establish some sort of security zone where they could then repatriate Ukrainians that are living in their countries that they really don't want, I imagine Putin might well turn a blind eye to it and just say, well, good luck, rather you than us. But he really wants neutrality for whatever remains of this Ukrainian state. And we don't know what that's going to look like because we haven't negotiated. We haven't had any discussions or talks publicly. And I have, a lot of reservations about supposedly talks behind the scenes, because the people in the White House continue to make ridiculous demands. I mean, you're telling Mr. Putin that he effectively has to bow down and beg forgiveness for having ever, violated the sacrosanct boundaries of Ukraine, which have changed over the last 300 years multiple times. And then he's supposed to effectively commit suicide and take himself out of office and turn Russia's resources over to the West. And this brings me to a very key point. I think that there is a minority, a very powerful elite in the West that views Russia on the one hand as a threat because it is a national state. It is rooted in Orthodox Christianity and a Russian ethnic national identity. It has been the plan of the so-called globalist elites, people like Soros and Schwab and others, to effectively erase the identities of the European peoples and to flood them with people from North Africa, the Middle East, and Africa. This is something that Putin has resisted, and most Europeans in the East dislike and will not participate in. So I think Soros back in the 90s, along with many of his comrades, decided we've got to destroy Russia. We've got to fight Russia and beat it into submission so that we can do to Russia what is now being done to Germany, France, Britain, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands. And having been in and out of Europe for many, many times over my life, and having lived for 10 years in Europe, 8 of which I've spent in and out of Germany, I must tell you that they've had a terrible impact on Europe. I don't see anything positive emerging from importing millions of Muslim, Arabs, Africans, and so forth. In fact, I see the opposite. I see real conflict emerging because the objective was never for any of these people to assimilate into European society. It was always the objective for them to assimilate Europe. And so Mr. Putin will have nothing to do with it and will fight with his dying breath to prevent Russia from going the way of Western Europe. It's that simple. And I think that's behind. The second part of it is there's a huge payoff to destroying Russia. You get access to endless sources of minerals, oil, gas, an abundance of food, all the things which many of the people at the top in the West would like to have access to and ultimately to control. All you have to do is look at these wonderful photographs that show Mr. Zelensky sitting in a room with this man, Bank Friedman, who is a crook that belongs in jail that hasn't yet made it to prison, and at the same time talking on a big video television screen to none other than Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. So you start lining all these people up. There's more to this than meets the eye. And I think the Swedes, the Danes, anybody who right now who is in NATO that underwrites this business or wants to join NATO is probably foolish because they're being dragged into something that they didn't initiate. And I think if most people knew what was really happening, wouldn't have anything to do with it.
I agree. Couldn't agree with you more. Let's jump to another thing. You mentioned the White House and the top brass. I guess Mark Milley, what's his position in the U.S. military? He's some kind of high up 4-star, I guess, Mark Milley.
Well, we call it chairman of the Joint Chiefs. We do not have a unified military command structure.
All right.
It's very beneficial to Congress. We have 44 4-stars.
Mm-hmm.
No one's in charge. That's a big advantage if you're trying to spend money. And that's what Congress is about. And it's done wonders for the defense industries. Mm-hmm. So Milley is just, quote unquote, the chairman of a committee of chiefs of staff of the armed services, all of whom are preeminently interested in what they can get for their respective service. Mm-hmm. So there is no unity of purpose or effort whatsoever. We pay lip service to this, what do you call it, jointness, mm-hmm. but it's a facade. And that's a huge problem. By the way, the Russians don't have that problem.
Right. No, I think it's crystal clear on that side. Now, the reason I brought up Mark Milley, because he said something remarkable that I picked up. He said that Ukraine still have aces up its sleeves, and then he referred to the U.S. training of Ukrainian soldiers in Germany. And he got, I guess they sang along with Lloyd Austin in this saying that, well, Ukraine has aces up its sleeve. What do you think of that statement?
I think that Mark Milley has not figured out that the Easter Bunny died in the same car crash that killed Santa Claus and the Good Fairy. There isn't much hope for Ukraine at this stage. Hundreds of thousands of people have been destroyed or maimed and harmed for eternity. He is simply doing whatever his bosses want, and that's how he ultimately got the job. Remember what I said about these so-called conflicts. Mm-hmm. Very few American soldiers or Marines actually have seen any real action. Most of it is analogous to colonial expeditions that were launched in the late 1800s or early 1900s by the British or the French or the Dutch or the Belgians against effectively weak opponents inside their respective empires. Mm-hmm. That's what this has always been. We had these forward operating bases, these giant garrisons that were installed in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Most people never left them. And the people that did were only out there for short periods. And again, if there was any real evidence for hostility that was dangerous, in came the airstrikes, artillery strikes, and so forth. This is not war. This is the sort of thing that Clausewitz called a war of observation, mm-hmm. Which is not really a life or death proposition for the state. It's not a war of decision that decides the future of the country. What Milley and his friends don't believe in is the possibility that this war in Russia and Eastern Europe could turn into a war of decision. And that's a very serious mistake, because whereas we are treating Ukraine and its population as an instrument, something we can exploit to harm Russia, which is the stated goal of this entire business, the Russians view this as an existential threat to their existence and their right to do so. One side is in it to the finish. The other side is not. Mm-hmm. And that's eminently clear, and was very clear, by the way, at the Vilnius conference, because behind the scenes, someone as weak-minded as Scholz at least had the presence of mind to tell Biden and others, look, we don't want to destroy Russia. Mm-hmm. That's not our interest. We didn't sign up for that. Well, actually, they did. They were very stupid. Mm-hmm. He, Macron, and everybody else just allowed themselves to be dragged along. Mm-hmm. And there's a good reason for that. What kind of military power do they offer? What sort of alliance is Sweden joining? Well, I was talking recently to a good friend who's a retired general in the French army. He and I worked together 20 years ago at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. And he said, Douglas, if you take all the tanks that you have in Great Britain, Germany, and France and add them together, and he said, these are the ones that in theory work, we have 600 tanks. He said the same thing's true for artillery. He said these forces are prepared to go on safari in Africa or the Middle East or somewhere else. They're not prepared for a real war. Mm-hmm. And the assumption is that we, the United States, we are prepared for it. We aren't.
Mm-hmm.
We have dismantled much of our military power. We spend a lot of money, but a lot of that money, of course, disappears into the pockets of all sorts of people across the United States, and most important, people in Washington. It's a racket.
Yeah.
So we are not the great power in a military sense that we were in 1991. And people don't seem to understand that. I don't think people in Washington get it. We could put 5,000 fighters in the air in 1991. We had over 300,000 ground troops on the ground in Iraq in 1991. That was not the entire force by any stretch of imagination. But could we do something like that today? Of course not.
Okay.
So what are the Swedes joining? What's the great benefit? I mean, why would the Swedes want to join a crusade against Russia that is weak, unfocused, with no particular tangible, concrete goal in sight? It doesn't make any sense.
No. Well, the standing argument is protection. Sweden needs protection, says the politicians here. Of course, we had a dismantled military organization during the early 90s where conscription was canceled, and they got rid of a lot of material and equipment. But of course, Sweden has a manufacturing capacity of its own. We make our own fighter jets. We make cannons and artillery in Bofors, which is all owned by one family called the Wallenbergs. They control pretty much all the Swedish industries, like Ericsson in the telecom section. They're part owners of Raytheon in the US and so forth. So the sensible thing to do, according to myself, that is that Sweden just should step up to what we had before, have their own modernized defense. We have a formidable air force with about 175 units active of the JAS Gripen, which is compatible to the F-16 in performance. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. It makes no sense at all for Sweden to join what we don't know exactly what it is. But as you describe it, it's dysfunctional. And I also read something that of the 155 millimeter shells, which is commonly used in various artilleries, there are something like 200 variants of it that's not compatible between a Swedish 155 millimeter and a German or a NATO. And it was going to cost some horrendous amounts of money to standardize these munitions of the 155 millimeter.
Well, we've had 50 years inside NATO to achieve some level of uniformity and interoperability across national lines in many respects. And what have we done? Nothing.
Yeah.
What NATO has that it doesn't really need is an absolute enormous overhead of headquarters. Because NATO, in the European sense, is designed to provide jobs for generals. Beyond that, I don't see it doing very much. And by the way, I had a very high opinion of the Swedish forces that I saw back in the 90s when I was in Sweden on a visit. Yeah. And it is unfortunate that they have been dismantled largely. There was no real need to do that. But here's the bottom line is this. What makes everyone think that the Russians are so desperate to march all the way across Finland to get to Sweden, or that they want to fight inside the Arctic Circle? I mean, I just don't see much evidence for that.
No,
I think the Russians really want to do business.
Yeah.
It's obvious that Putin did not want this conflict. He spent years telling everybody what he didn't want, trying to persuade people that if we ultimately tried to turn Ukraine into a platform for attack against Russia, there would be a war. But we didn't bother to listen. Exactly. He made a plea in 2008 in Bucharest. He's spoken repeatedly on this. He supplied several proposals. We refused to entertain any of them. And what interest do we as Americans have in fighting a war 10,000 miles from home in an area most Americans can't identify on a map for reasons that make no sense because we want to harm Russia? Well, maybe Soros and his friends that are in finance and the media want desperately to harm Russia, but the rest of us, we're not terribly interested in that. And this is not a question of, is Russia some sort of pristine utopia that we should all emulate? That's not the point. Russia is Russia. It has its pros, it has its cons.
Yep.
By the way, the same is true for us.
Mm-hmm.
The United States is hardly the pristine liberal democratic utopia that everybody thinks it is. Mm-hmm. And anybody who bothers to pay attention to what's happening in this country will understand that. So, you know, it is depressing. And I wish the Swedes would reconsider the wisdom of doing what they're doing. And personally, if you go back to Eisenhower, when he was president of the United States, he made the point that in the world that we were living in after World War II, we could not rapidly reinforce Western Europe against the Soviets. Mm-hmm. He said we're never going to have enough ships and enough planes and enough men on active duty to get there in a time that makes any difference. Well, that's one of the reasons you had the West German army.
Yeah.
Because we couldn't possibly get there. And secondly, he said we should look for more neutral countries. And they said, what do you mean, Mr. President? He said, the more countries we can neutralize in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, Northern Europe, the less territory we have to defend, because we can't defend all of it.
Yes.
On a conventional sense, then we were much stronger than we are now, just as we were very strong conventionally in 1991. Yet now we want to expand the size of this alliance at a point in time when we are least able to defend it. There's an expression for this in Britain. It's covenants without swords. Yeah. In other words, making commitments that you can't possibly honor because you don't have the military power to support it. Mm-hmm. So how long before the Russians call your bluff?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think you mentioned George Soros. I think in 93, he said something along the lines that NATO needs to expand eastwards, but we will have to use other people's soldiers, meaning like mm-hmm. Poles or Ukrainians or, you know, Finland, maybe, I don't know. So that's really cynical. Sweden, also back to it, short, just decided to send another 6 billion krona to Ukraine in forms of weapons and assistance. And that brings a total of, if I translate it into dollars, what Sweden has supplied, they had supplied a Panzer Model 90, a bunch of armor-piercing handheld things, bazookas or whatever you call them. That amounts to right now $2.8 billion. And Sweden has a deficit problem. We have problem with the free healthcare system that actually got reduced to this year with 8 million Swedish krona, 8 billion, sorry. So it's just crazy. And another thing here, I read some news that the United States is going to call up about 3,000 reservists to deploy in Europe. Is that going to make any difference or any sense?
No, 3,000 from the reserves, but also another 600 from the individual ready reserve. So what we're doing is we're trying to fill gaps or holes in specialties, especially in logistics, medical operations, and so forth. It's not going to change the picture militarily at all.
Yeah.
If you called up 300,000, that would make a difference. But then you and I both know that it would take months to train them. Yeah. I mean, we've watched the Russians. They brought up 320,000, and it took them several months to bring them back up to speed, then to assimilate them into organizations to get them ready to fight. Mm-hmm. I mean, all of these things take time. It doesn't make any sense. But, you know, here's the big lie. If we don't stop the Russians in eastern Ukraine, they're going to march across Europe. Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Again, the numbers aren't there. I don't see the intention, never have. I don't see the wherewithal on the Russian side. Mm-hmm. So that it just is foolish nonsense. I mean, the Russians have privately said, look, we'll get to the Dnieper River.
Yeah.
And if we want to cross it, we can cross it. But the problem is, if we're going to march all the way to the Polish border, we're going to need some more troops.
Yeah.
Now, this may not make much difference to Ukrainians, or excuse me, Swedes, but Ukraine is about the size of Texas.
Right.
Texas is big as hell.
Yeah, it's
It's a
really
big
large.
place.
Yeah.
And you can go from one end to the other and take days to do it. It's huge. So there's a lot of unreality in the play here, and people, I guess, are easily scared. It's unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, people are scared for climate change also. Would this proxy war come to an end if the West stops sending money and equipment? What do you think? Would it stop?
The Ukrainians will lose. They're losing anyway, but
Yeah.
they would lose catastrophically. I think the way to end this is as following. First of all, you want a ceasefire and you want to have talks, but you can't get there unless you agree to three things. First, we've got to acknowledge that whatever state emerges from this disaster is going to be neutral.
Yeah.
It's astonishing to me that there's so much resistance to that in the West, because when I was at SHAPE in 1998, 99, we said, when somebody said, well, what is Ukraine's role in Europe? And we all laughed and said, to keep the Russian forces, 500 miles to the east. In other words, leave Ukraine alone. It's doing its job. If you leave it alone, it's this big, vast expanse where there are no Russian troops.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this doesn't make any sense. The second part of it is, if you agree to neutrality, then you must immediately suspend the delivery of all aid, and then you've got to get all the NATO personnel inside Ukraine out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you do those three things, the Russians will sit down and talk to you.
Yeah.
But keep in mind, when it comes to territorial arrangements, the Russians aren't about to surrender territory they fought hard to gain. So you're going to have to be realistic about what remains of Ukraine. Now, if you do that today, Ukraine will amount to something. Mm. But if we don't do anything now, Ukraine will simply shrink and shrink and shrink to the point where there's almost nothing left. It's what people call the Ukrainian rump state. Mm. And there's one other thing. When you start talking about joining NATO, we did not bother to point out that too many nations in Eastern Europe have agendas which are ultimately incompatible with the NATO's alliance mission. And what's the mission? The mission, we thought, was to keep peace in Europe, to prevent the outbreak of another war.
Yes.
It had nothing to do with conquering new territory or expansion. Well, you've got Poles and Lithuanians and Slovaks and Hungarians and Romanians and Latvians and Estonians. Everybody has an agenda. Mm-hmm. Everybody wants territory that was formerly theirs, whether you go back 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years. Eastern Europe's a lot like the Balkans. Yeah. What happened in 1650 is just yesterday. Mm-hmm. Old grudges never go away. Yeah. An appetite for new territory or old territory that was formerly theirs that isn't anymore never stops. So naturally, you have Hungarians living in the Carpathians inside Ukraine, right, who, by the way, hate it, want nothing to do with it, dislike the Ukrainians intensely. Yeah. So naturally, Mr. Orban says, well, they should be part of Hungary.
Yeah.
And Mr. Putin has said, sure, we agree. It's not a problem. Well, at some point, as this war is painfully lost, we're going to see Poles and Lithuanians and Hungarians and others that are all going to come to the table with their knives and forks, ready to dine on whatever is out there.
Yeah.
This is something which we, especially Americans, know nothing about.
Right.
We can't fix this. We can't referee it and manage it. And if we can't, then maybe you, the Swedes, can help do that. You've lived there long enough. You've been at war with everybody at some point. But this is beyond us. It's another reason why I don't think the expansion should have occurred the way it did. No. And I don't think we have any business being in the area.
Yeah, I agree. Speaking about that, in Kosovo, it's blossoming up unrest because the Kosovo regime just ordered a bunch of drones and a bunch of weapons from Turkey. And that, of course, upsets the Serb population that feels that Kosovo is a part of Serbia. And the Balkans is just a mishmash of hostilities left and right, north and south. So,
and that's true, but we had an opportunity to divide that child. There could have been new territorial arrangements, and the Germans in particular were willing to fund a lot of that by helping populations move to areas where they would feel secure because they were living with their own people. And the answer from Washington is, well, that's wrong. That's 19th century thinking. We don't live that way anymore. We're all going to live together in the diverse utopia. Well, you and I know there's nothing more diverse in Europe than Europeans.
Right.
You're not going to make them happy by forcing them into a union they don't want. Look how close Sweden and Norway came to a war at the beginning of the 20th century.
Right.
What a disaster that would have been. Is anybody who spends time in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, we look around and we know there are differences, but why would these people kill each other? It doesn't make any sense. We should be taking the same view of what's happening in Ukraine. There's no reason for this. And this is not some grand design on Putin's part at all. On the contrary, this is a design that we've contributed to in Washington, in Brussels, in Paris, London, and Berlin. It's insane.
Right. Well, when I lived in the United States, most of the 80s, one of the things that struck me is how little most Americans know about the rest of the world. I mean, that's very obvious, but it's kind of refreshing to talk to Americans that do have an insight in the rest of the world. I mean, there's a reason they call the baseball league in the United States the World Series. All right. I don't know if you have
Abraham Lincoln used to say in Washington, advancement in politics, so there's no bar to ignorance. In other words, there's nothing to prevent you from being elected and wielding power in Washington, regardless of how ignorant you are. Today, I think we suffer from an excess of both ignorance and arrogance. We are arrogant based on a position that we occupied in 1992. Then there was an interest on the same kinds of people right now who are pushing war in Ukraine. People in 1992 decided, well, the world is our oyster. We can do with it what we want. And then we can refashion it to suit us. This was a catastrophe. The United States had an opportunity to say, good luck. We'll be there if you need us. We'll support you. But ultimately, Europe is European. We're going home. I felt very strongly that we should do that at the time. And everybody said, oh, no, that would be a disaster. The Europeans will immediately fight with each other. And I said, well, there's always a possibility, but I think it's unlikely. And what we should do is get out of the way. I felt strongly we should have a European as the four-star who commands the NATO alliance. We just needed to step back. That didn't mean we needed to leave the alliance. We could stay in it, but let the Europeans call the tune. Let them drive this train. We were unwilling to do that. So we are now involved everywhere on the assumption, the false assumption, by the way, that we're the indispensable power. Well, I suppose if you want someone with a lot of power and money to come in and make a mess of your country, we do a brilliant job. Well, thank you so much, Colonel, for coming on this modest little channel. I have mostly Swedish viewers, but Swedes do understand English quite well, and maybe not speak it that good, but everybody understands perfectly the English language. So I'm infinitely grateful that you took your time out from your busy schedule to be on this little channel. And maybe we can return sometime soon and continue observing the development, because it happens things every day in the East now. So, well, we'll just wait for things to develop here economically and financially. We've already seen this crisis begin in Europe. I think we're going to have similar troubles here. And whenever we have these serious internal financial and economic difficulties or societal problems, Americans always do the same thing. We turn inward completely and suddenly realize that whatever happens beyond our borders really doesn't make much difference to us. Right. I think we'll witness that in the future. I think so. And my best to everybody in Sweden. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you so much, Colonel. Right. And thanks for the viewers. Bye-bye.